Happy holidays, everyone. Are you clamoring to learn more about a specific topic in psychology? Are you interested in bonus Why Do We Do That content? Visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/Why Do We Do That podcast to become a paid subscriber. For only $3 per month, you will receive early access to new releases, exclusive bonus questions, and in-depth video reflections about each episode. Plus, you'll gain access to one-on-one communication with myself and priority consideration for topic suggestions. Finally, the holiday break is a great time to try a new podcast. So please share an episode with one of your friends. I'll see you in 2025. Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Richard and Colin Guare. Richard is a neuropsychologist and board-certified behavior analyst who serves as director of the Center for Learning and Attention Disorders at Seacoast Mental Health Center in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He received his doctorate in school/child clinical psychology from the University of Virginia and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology at Harvard Medical School, Children's Hospital, Boston. Dr. Guare serves as a consultant to schools and agencies in programs for autism, learning, attention, and behavior disorders and acquired brain injuries. Richard, along with Dr. Peg Dawson, is the co-author of the book Smart But Scattered: The Revolutionary Executive Skills Approach to Helping Kids Reach Their Potential, as well as numerous other titles within the Smart But Scattered collection. Richard's son, Colin, joined on as a third author of the second edition of Smart But Scattered, which was released in November of 2024. Colin is a behavior analyst and writer who has also contributed to several other books in the Smart But Scattered collection. Richard, Colin, and myself sat down to discuss the process of developing executive skills in children. Executive skills are cognitive processes that help us regulate our behavior, make decisions, and set and achieve goals. One key takeaway from my chat was the importance of having a framework to assess and build your child's ability to think. Many behavioral problems parents encounter with their children directly connect to 1 to 2 executive skills outlined in Richard and Colin's book. It's often said that there's no manual for being a parent, but I'd like to think that Richard and Colin's framework can give parents the ability to identify and understand their child's specific needs, as well as their specific strengths that could be leveraged to improve in other areas. Additionally, it was helpful to learn that most executive skills should be fostered via independent experiences and natural consequences, while lecturing and direct instruction should be limited. We often expect our children to absorb every word or command that comes out of our mouth. And while there are opportunities to talk to your kids about how to behave in certain situations, unrealistic expectations about the learning process can lead to frustration and just an overall negative energy around the pursuit of personal development. If you are a parent that lacks confidence and/or knowledge about how to build good habits and foster effective thinking in your child, I believe this conversation will give you the tools you need to get started. Enjoy. Okay, I am joined by Dick and Colin Guare. Thank you so much for being on today.
Sure, happy to be here.
Glad to be here, Ryan. Thank you.
Dick and Colin, as well as Peg Dawson, I believe, is the third author of a book called Smart But Scattered: The Revolutionary Executive Skills Approach to Helping Kids Reach Their Potential. The second edition just came out, and so today we're going to be talking about some of the principles in that book that relate to executive functioning in children. Um, Colin is Richard's son and joined Richard in the second edition. So thank you again for being on. Um, why don't we just give an overview of executive skills? Because executive skills are very concrete and there are lots of them. So why don't you give an overview of the executive skills that you address in your book and in your research?
I think just to give people an idea, I think one of the best analogies we've seen, just as a kind of overview for executive skills, is one that came out of the Harvard Center for Developing Child. They describe executive skills in general as the brain's air traffic control system, and it strikes us that that's a pretty accurate, analogy for it. Um, In our particular model, for kids, there are 11 executive skills. I don't need to go through all of them, but they cover things, such as response inhibition, sustained attention, um, planning, organization, time management, emotional control, flexibility. Um, which other ones am I leaving out? Call
Uh, ti-
metacognition.
Time management, organization.
Yep, time management, organization. As I say, metacognition. But a whole host of skills, all of which are in one way or another necessary for learning and for executing actions, for problem solving and for the effective execution of any actions that you undertake.
Yeah, and I like how you sort of separate them into these categories of thinking and doing. It kind of gives some delineation between the two sets of skills, right? Because there's an internal experience that children develop over time, and then there's the interacting with the world part, which I mean, they do relate, but they are kind of separate in terms of how they end up being applied.
Yep, that's true. Although I think over time, one of the things that we see is they come more and more together so that they really do operate in principle as something that kids will bring to bear, particularly as they get a little bit older, will bring to bear on any task. Particularly if you take metacognition as a thinking skill, then, you know, going back, working memory is another one, which we've described as more thinking skills. But when you enter a new situation, how you solve problems in the past and what your experiences, what your long-term experiences have been in those particular situations come into play in any new situation that you come into. So that's where that distinction gets a little bit blurred, like over a period of time. But in general, we think it still holds up pretty well.
So we're going to get into some of the principles for developing executive functioning in kids. We're going to talk about some actual specific executive functioning skills. Get very specific. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about whether or not we should think of normal versus ADHD brains in the same way. So a lot of the work that I've come across with Russell Barkley, who's been doing ADHD research for a long time, he will, in his writing, classify ADHD as a disability specifically related to executive functioning. And some of his recommendations suggest that, you know, that the condition of having ADHD is extremely limiting in terms of their ability to ever develop optimal executive functioning. And so I'm curious as to your opinion. Do you think that there need to be any caveats about the recommendations for a typical child going through development versus an ADHD diagnosed child?
Yeah, I mean, on the serve, I love uh, Russ Barkley's stuff as much as anyone, and it's he's always been sort of like a milestone for, and obviously a kind of founding father in a way for a lot of this stuff. Um, I think it's I would almost say it's different because it's a different question that I'd ask myself depending on whether I was Russ Barkley or whether I was a parent of a child. For any given child, their limitations, their skill set, their strengths are going to be unique no matter whether or not they're diagnosed with ADHD or not. And so the ceiling on what and I think also it's so difficult to make some sort of prediction long term about A, whether or not a kid will or won't be able to develop skills, and B, whether or not the whether or not even in the case if they weren't, whether or not that would really prevent them from achieving whatever it is that they wanted to achieve. I mean, as an adult, I would say that I'm pretty happy and proud with my career and my professional advancement at this point. My organization is not great. Anybody in my family could tell you that. And if I flip this camera around, which I will not, you would learn it very quickly that my organization is still a weakness of mine. And yet, I've found coping strategies. I've found pieces of technology. I've found support networks of personal people to kind of help me through that. And so it's a good question, but I think a really complex one to answer. And I wouldn't want to paint with a broad brush. Dad?
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think that the variability of the skills, Colin mentioned organization. I I don't I've never been diagnosed with an attention disorder. I don't think of myself as having an attention disorder. My organization is rivals probably Colin's in terms of a weakness, if it's not worse. And I think that's one of the things that we discovered early on in thinking about this kind of from a theoretical perspective that while while you could think about ADHD as impacting executive skills, which executive skills are impacted and the extent to which they're impacted really does vary enormously from child to child. And I think that, if you look in the history of people who either were diagnosed as children or um, who subsequently, came to the conclusion that they've had attention disorders, a lot of them are pretty high achievers and have managed either to overcome those or to compensate, to find ways, to compensate for those in the same way that anybody with, I mean, when we think about executive skills, we think about them in general as, you've got a set of strengths, you've got a set of weaknesses. And everybody seems to show up with that kind of a profile. In the same way that I find ways to compensate for my weaknesses in time management and organization, I think that, kids and adults with ADHD have found ways to compensate for whatever particular area of their cognition has been most affected by ADHD. I know Barkley highlights, response inhibition and sustained attention as kind of the hallmarks of that. And I think that there's, to some extent that's true. But even within that, if you think about sustained attention, um, if you if you look at kids or adults with ADHD, and depending on what it is that they're involved in, they can show phenomenally good sustained attention to tasks. And the same thing with response inhibition. Like we certainly meet um, and have worked with adults who've had, weaknesses in what they would describe as response inhibition, and yet it hasn't become an impediment to any kind of achievement in their careers or in their, in the types of things that they've been able to accomplish over time. So I'd agree with Colin. I think that painting it with a broad brush and saying, you know, kind of unequivocally, these people are going to have trouble and be disabled in this area is probably a little bit broader than we would ever want to go.
You could also just consider it that these skills could also be just one big part of their development. So they
Yes.
might be in a different place and maybe medication is mixed in, but you can't, I mean, you'd be naive to think that you could just solve executive functioning problems with medication. Not to mention that in your book, you talk so much about identifying where a child is. And if you can identify, are we at the starting point? Is this a motivation thing? Is this an ability thing? Because that's not always clear, but even a child with ADHD, maybe you have to go through some of the steps a few more times, which is already kind of built into your model of building executive skills.
Yes, that's true.
Hmm.
So let's stay on this a little bit more. How do parents assess their child's abilities? Because it's a very different problem to have lack of motivation versus lack of ability. And sometimes it's kind of difficult to tell where a child is. I know I've had experiences with my stepdaughter um, where I at first I thought it was a lack of ability, and then I saw her working on her math, and she got a 6 out of 6, and it's like, oh, okay, so maybe the homework struggles we were having yesterday was something different from lack of ability. And on the other hand, I've also seen situations, where parents are trying to teach parents are trying to get their kids to clean their room, and they just give commands, and they're like, common sense would suggest, like, just clear the floor, clean your room. Why is your room always so messy? Without taking into account that for many people, adults included, cleaning is a skill set that you have to learn. Organization is a skill set that you have to learn. So in terms of your advice for parents, like, how do you accurately assess if ability versus motivation is the issue? What are some things you can look for?
Uh, in the book, we outlined three things. One was, is the task developmentally appropriate for the child? So, and part of the reason why we put that in there is because if you've got other children or if you've observed other children, sometimes you leap to the conclusion that, well, at this age, these kids ought to be able to do this particular
Right.
thing. Again, considering there's so much variability in the skill levels of kids, that what's developmentally appropriate for one child may not be developmentally appropriate for another child. So that's kind of job one. The second thing is that when your example of room cleaning is a good one, because people assume that there's a kind of common sense way of going about that. But in
Right.
fact, if you look at the way that people go about cleaning in any kind of situation, everybody's got their own particular preferences and peculiarities about the way that they go about it. Um, and so to assume that somehow this is a skill that you're born with, this notion about, well, I can just pick up and organize things and that will take care of it, which is where a lot of parents end up. They think that, well, cleaning it ought to be kind of self-evident, when in fact it's not. And the third thing is, and particularly critical when you're trying to make this distinction between motivation and ability, is the child truly independent at the task? A lot of people, you gave an example of your stepdaughter with math, and so one day she seems to be struggling with math and the next day she isn't. And that may be a motivation issue. On the other hand, what we've discovered over time is that context makes all the difference in the world. And simple variations in the nature of the way that a problem is presented or the way that a situation is presented really does make a difference in terms of whether kids are able to independently approach the task or not. And so one of the first questions that we want to know all of the time is, have you ever have you ever observed your child to perform the task completely independently and without assistance? And if you look at something like room cleaning, that's a rare phenomenon. Parents don't necessarily, they assume that if kids are capable of picking up clothes on command, then somehow they've learned that particular skill. But when you think about it in the context of what it takes to organize a room and what the principles are involved are, including distractions that are in the room, it becomes a much more complicated issue. And so those three factors, developmentally appropriate, is it within the skill set of the child, even to begin with, and have they performed the task independently? We want to know the answers to those questions before we're going to make a decision about whether this is motivation or whether this is a skill deficit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Couple quick things I would add. Sometimes I look for big variability in performance on tasks that seem very similar to me. Do they perform this task very fluently in one setting and with great difficulty or not at all in another? That might be more of a hint to me that this is a motivation issue rather than a skill issue. Although, again, as my dad said, context matters. The second thing, going right back to what I said, is context. It's remember these behaviors are always occurring in context, and they're always occurring in history along a timeline. We don't isolate behaviors into a single instance. If we were at the gym and you saw me try to dunk a basketball and I missed, would you know it was because I didn't know how or because I wasn't trying hard enough? You really would have
Right.
no idea. You'd have to watch me over time and see what was I doing, what was my behavior like, what were the reinforcers for me, and only after a little while could you see or make some sort of assessment about, can I dunk the basketball and I'm just choosing not to, or I feel like it's not worth it, or do I really not have that skill yet? I think one place in which you might be able to, one place in which we can kind of observe this is, if you were to watch me over time attempting to dunk a basketball and I'm not getting any better, that's more
Right.
of a thing where I dig in and I say, okay, motivation, have we got the right reinforcers in place here? Or ability, do I appear to not know anything about jumping or reaching up to the rim or basketball in general? And I might be able to use some coaching, but it's observing that behavior over time repeatedly that's going to give me more clues about what the isolating variables are here. And then the one last thing I would say to parents is I always ask myself why I need to know that. Am I really sure I need to know and need to make a judgment call in this about whether or not this kid can do this and just doesn't want to or doesn't know how? And I think a lot of times when it comes to a relationship with parents and kids, especially around a task that a kid is self-conscious or not comfortable with, parents will get themselves into a sticky situation trying to make that judgment call when really the approach that they would take would be similar no matter what I thought the issue was. I could try modifying the reinforcer and seeing that helped and then go to some coaching afterwards. My process for that in helping kids at the public schools that I work at is not any different regardless of what I think the issue might be. I'm still sort of trying to knock down these suspects one at a time until I get to the right thing. And so as much as parents kind of want to be able to diagnose and then jump to the conclusion, I would sometimes recommend that they exercise a little bit of caution and maybe just, again, observe over time and see and get a better feel for it before kind of coming to the idea either my kid doesn't want to or they don't know how.
And also, I mean, I think sometimes parents have this expectation that once you've crossed a certain threshold that you never go back.
Right.
It's like they might interpret it as falling back or losing a skill, but in reality, to your point, it's probably more of a contextual issue rather than them falling or losing a skill.
Yeah, it's like going to the gym versus counting, you know. Once I learn those numbers, it's going to take a lot for me to forget them, you know. But you know, going to the gym or staying in shape, as we all know, is not a skill that gets mastered once and then exists forever with no you know, variation.
So the book dives into some specific scenarios. I'm going to save those, and for a little bit, I'd like to talk about the principles that are essential when you're trying to develop these executive functioning skills in your children. Let's start with the environment. Before you kind of suggest that before directly teaching a child a skill, you might focus on the environment because, as an example, if a child is stressed, or if they are in some sort of if there's some sort of distraction, or there are lots of factors about the environment that would completely derail the part where you're instructing. And so I think if I had to guess, that's why you would include that first. So, what are some key principles to consider when modifying your child's environment to support an executive skill?
Well, I think as Colin said, where we would start all the time and ask parents to start all the time is observe the child in the environment. I mean, in order to figure out what's going on, it's important to watch them. I know in the book, we gave an example of we've given a variety of examples. We gave an example of room cleaning, where a parent goes up with a child, they observe, what the child is able to do, um, and they ask questions, at that point. So they're just observing. If you give a general directive like, like let's go up and let me watch you kind of clean up your room. And the child goes into the room and they don't have no idea where to start. So as a parent, I mean, if I go in there, I want to, first of all, as Colin said, I want to know whether there's any distractions in the environment. Are there toys? Are there video games? Are there any of those kinds of things available? Um, but beyond that, um, I also want to ask them where they want to start. What would make sense to you? Where would you like to start by picking up your clothes? Would you like to start with, putting your toys away? Where would you like to start? So that they take the lead all of the time. And I think one of the things that we've tried to concentrate on, throughout the book and throughout our recommendations to parents is as much as you can observe and involve the child in that kind of decision making, that's really the first critical thing to do because it gives you much higher degree of assurance that if they've had some decision-making power in this situation, they're more likely to follow through. And they're also likely to follow their own inclination about what's difficult for them, as opposed to you guessing what's difficult. I mean,
Hmm.
when I think about if somebody tries to talk to me about organization, I, not there aren't a lot of good ideas out there, but I don't ever feel like people really understand what for me is going to get in my way unless they ask me what I think is the most critical issue that is an impediment for me in those kinds of situations. And so I think that, to the extent that you can ask kids and then to offer them some options, and that's what again we recommended in the book. We said to parents, you know, I think the example that we used was the kid said, he would like to pick up his clothes. Um, and the other part of that, the other part of the environmental modifications, you always start really small. Don't start with cleaning the room. You're starting with things like, picking up dirty socks,
Mhm.
picking up, dirty underwear, whatever it happens to be. Keep the task as small as possible so that the kid has the opportunity to experience some success and that they're not looking this as a much more global issue. It really is focusing on that. And you want the kid to be able to bring that skill to a level of automaticity so that they've really habituated that before you move on to whatever is next on their particular list about things to do. Okay, you've gotten this down, you've told me what would be helpful in terms of, where to put your dirty clothes. What would you like to work on next? And so to go at that, and this gets at something you ask later on, about parents parents are feeling like they're never going to get to this. It really is it's a process, and it takes time, and patience and small steps are really the critical issues in terms of success for this kind of thing.
I really liked all of the suggestions for making things physical using notes and checklists and schedules and stuff like that. It sounds it sounds like an obvious fact that children would need physical notes and paper and reminders everywhere. I mean, I think I have relatively good working memory, but I still write down everything. Either on paper or using my phone. I mean, I have reminders going off, all day long. Uh, and I try to use post-it notes. I'm still kind of trying to figure out like the optimal size of note that I can place around. And my fiance, we're tinkering with post-it notes for the kids as reminders and schedules. And I feel like today parents, maybe some are going all in on having physical notes in their house, but I feel at the same time that a lot of parents don't take advantage of the physical space using to-do lists, just maybe over relying on verbal commands like don't forget this, don't forget this. And I feel like it's a missed opportunity. In your view, in 2024, what is the state of using, physical schedules and to-do lists? Do you think that it's not used enough? Do you think it's used incorrectly?
I think that when we're proposing to use schedules with kids, whether those are digital, and there are some good kind of scheduling apps and pictorial apps that you can use that you can put on a phone. We've certainly used those with kids who are a little bit older, if parents don't have objections to kids having phones or iPads or things like that. But I think the other part of that is in the same way that we talk about involving kids in the task itself, their involvement in developing a kind of, for example, a picture schedule for themselves turns out to be really critical. So having them, for example, one of the things that we've used is kids will choose to have themselves have parents either take a picture of them or take a video of them performing a particular aspect of the task. If they take a picture of them, then that becomes the kids' picture schedule. But they are the character in the schedule. They can decide how to title it. And so the more involvement they have, even at that level of developing the schedule, as opposed to parents coming in and saying, well, let me give you this list. Maybe the list is relevant to the kid, maybe not. I think the other thing that I'd mention about those lists in general, beyond whether kids have a role in preparing them or not, is I don't know if you've noticed this, but post-it notes pretty quickly lose their effectiveness. And part of the reason for that is because we habituate to their presence in the physical environment. And so we've tended, if we're going to use schedules, we tend to use them in very specific situations, tend to try to have them designed in a way that the kid wanted them designed, but also to build in some other prompt for the kid. For example, it may be a signal, it may be an alarm, it might be something like that. I would guess that if you set alarms on your phone or you set signals on your phone, you're much more likely to pay attention to those than you are to post-it notes, because the post-it note becomes passive pretty quickly, whereas these other things actively intrude on your attention to be able to prompt you to move on to the next thing. So we think it has to have, for some kids, the schedules are just fine. So kids have bathroom schedules about what they're going to follow that they've designed, showing them brushing their teeth and washing their hands and so forth, or cleaning their room schedules where this is how they've chosen the task. But that really is for them. It's just a prompt to remember what the sequence of events for them is. But pretty quickly, they don't rely on those things anymore. pretty quickly that fades kind of into the background. Um, and initially parents might prompt them to just look at your schedule, or they can come up with their own prompts to look at the schedule. But I think having them involved in developing the schedule again keeps you from making assumptions about you knowing better what their organization or time management or planning is than they know themselves.
Yeah, usually most of what I see is not so much an issue of like what kinds of physical tools do they use, or do they use them too much or not enough, and more the second part of what you said is over reliance on verbal and vocal prompting, which it requires that the parent be there. They're very hard. They're historically very hard to fade. There's nothing that I can. It's very hard for me to give that prompt and not be in the room with the kid at the same time, and so it's a very, very fundamental issue with the verbal and vocal prompting. And just like my dad said with the sticky notes, just like when my partner leaves my shoes on the side of the stairs because I need to take them upstairs, the vocal prompts especially, and I'm sure all parents have experienced this, can become quickly ignorable. And then they become repeated, and then the parent becomes more frustrated until finally it hits a point where you either give a vocal prompt or do something else that signals to the kid, the other shoe's about to drop here and I need to get moving on this. And then parents get into a cycle of why didn't you just do it the first time and all that kind of. So I think also a big part of that is being mindful of your vocal prompts, having a consequence for if you're going to use any kind of prompt, or having consequences or rewards for, or at least getting the kid in the habit of thinking about that. I think one of the things that a couple of the things that we talked about today, brushing your teeth, cleaning your room, those are really tricky tasks depending on the age of the kid, especially for younger kids, because a lot of the reinforcement and reasons that we do that is social and their social or long-term health. And those are very tricky things because, why does a 5-year-old care about their room being dirty? And how are they going to understand that what they do now affects their teeth when they're 35? They're very difficult for a kid to contextualize. And so we have to have some sort of outside reinforcement or punishment for that. And I think parents, a lot of times it's not so much even the prompting tool, it's that parents are applying reinforcement or punishment inconsistently for the performance of those things. You brush your teeth one night, you get X. You brush the teeth the next night and nothing happens. You don't brush your teeth one night and Y happens, and then the next day you do the same thing and nothing happens. Or your mom or dad tells you to brush your teeth 5 times and you don't, and then nothing happens. It's a lot of that where it's like, I think the consistency, and maybe honestly, the prompt and the reminder kind of has to lay with the parent a little bit. If it's something you want your kid to do, put a reminder on your own phone to remind them, or to set up that physical prompt and to be more consistent about it. And that'll probably help, I think. I have a lot of reminders on my phone that are not things that I need to do. They're things that I need to remind my kids about.
So, moving past the environment, you also address some best practices for direct instruction, right? There's some do's and don'ts, you might say, when it comes to directly instructing your child and coaching them up on a specific executive skill. What are some tips that parents can use when directly instructing their kids?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes from the first edition to the second edition of the book that we've now talked about is moving a lot more in the direction of naturalistic teaching. And so I think the first thing I would say is limiting greatly your direct instruction, especially the younger the kid is, the less direct instruction I'm interested in, because as we know, although when successful, it can be very valuable because it's so efficient. Direct instruction is really, let me give you an abstract idea and let you apply it to a bunch of different circumstances. And what we've found in reality is people aren't very good at that. In any walk of life, people aren't necessarily very good at that. It's a very difficult thing to do, to be able to take a lesson and then apply it as a principle to a bunch of different things that come up in your life. And so we've gone much more away from the direct instruction and much more to the naturalistic teaching with the new edition of the book, and trying to encourage parents to, instead of thinking of teaching a lesson on an executive skill, more so being present, and if you have ideas about something, if you've identified a sort of pattern that you feel your kid needs to work on that focuses on a certain executive skill, trying to think about the daily routines, the instances in your life when that thing might arise, and just doing a little bit of pre-planning and saying, how might I test this? Where is the limit of support that this kid needs? And how might I give them that this time? And then next time, give them a little bit less and try a little bit less and just experiment with it in the natural environment. And I would say, Dad, we can do, I would say more instruction maybe for older kids, adolescents, teenagers. But again, I would echo some things that my dad said and say the more that can be self-directed and the more I can have an open conversation with my kid and get to a point where they are the ones identifying that this is a skill that they'd like to improve or how it might help them, then the better off I'll be. I think when we as parents get into a situation of, I think you need to be better at this, we know that with teenagers and I mean, any kid over the age of 10 and probably even younger, but if the message is, I, the parent, think you, the child, need to be better at this, kids are A, very good at picking up on that, and B, they are very good at telling you to stick it. Mm-hmm. So the more we can have a conversation about how this situation might be impacting them and maybe give them the space and time to arrive at a conclusion, which I think in most cases, kids they want to be better. They want to lead more enjoyable lives. They'd like to improve. They just don't want anybody else to tell them that they have to. And so give them the space to arrive at the conclusion themselves, and then maybe offer some ways that you might be able to give them some support in building that skill.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would mention is that rather than verbal instruction, modeling goes a long way. I mean, I think about watching Colin with his daughter, our granddaughter, how much she's picked up just by virtue of him modeling what he's doing on a kind of day in and day out basis and copying his modeling. For example, she's very good at, and early on was she's 3.5 now. She's very good about picking up and cleaning up after herself and taking things. And that all came out of, very little of it came out of any kind of direct instruction at all, other than imitating essentially what he was doing. And kids are great at, especially younger kids are great at doing that. And Colin mentioned all of the day in and kind of day out activities, giving them the opportunity to do, for example, to help around the kitchen, setting the table, picking up the laundry, taking the laundry downstairs, those kinds of things. Kids are great at doing that because, first of all, they want to imitate their parents. Secondly, there's a sense of, for them, that sense of mastery and being more adult-like is really what they're seeking. And so that drive to be both independent, but also to demonstrate to your parents that I'm capable of doing what you did and doing it well also, is a huge payoff for them in the absence of any kind of external incentive at all. And so I think that one of the things that we've suggested to parents is that kind of modeling and scaffolding that goes. If you're going to put verbal instruction in there, the verbal instruction is really just an add-on to the modeling if you think the explanation will help, or if they ask you questions about it. But otherwise, the modeling alone goes a long way toward helping them develop those kinds of skills. When you think about look at kids at a playground, they watch other kids and then they try out what the other kids are trying out without any kind of communication ever having happened other than observing and them going through this kind of trial and error process themselves. Parents really can take advantage of that.
Yeah, Camilo Ortiz is a child psychologist. He's a popular presence on X or Twitter, and he's actually doing some research looking at this idea of megadoses of independence and how it has such an incredible impact on young people in terms of reducing anxiety and other negative mental health symptoms. And it kind of echoes what you're saying about about shifting the narrative away from less talking, more experience. It seems as though that's sort of the summary of the idea.
Absolutely. And I think we would say that, and that we endorse, I mean, a lot of that, even going back in the day, a lot of that, the Montessori teaching, and that sort of idea of like, you need to kind of give them some free reign. We've got this space, this virtual and physical space, allow them some free reign within the environment, to build those skills.
I want to mention one other thing. I think the other thing that we focus on this in the newest edition of the book. There's a discussion about embodied cognition. And we think embodied cognition is really a critical issue here. That's why kids being physically involved in these kinds of activities, rather than getting verbal instruction, having the opportunity to perform an action, they're much more likely to retain that kind of information, but it interacts with their own cognition in a way that's very different from that kind of traditional model of verbal instruction toward this is what you need to do. If kids had the chance to experience, number one, to make their own decisions, and number two, to experience that, mistakes and all, then that turns out to be both a powerful learning principle, but also a real asset in terms of developing executive skills, because it really does become part of that notion of embodied cognition.
So earlier you mentioned consequences, and I think this is probably especially important for younger children, but incentives can be tricky, right? The idea that you reward certain behaviors, in many cases, you're punishing negative behaviors. We know that from some old psychology research that if you incentivize it to do something that they already enjoy, like reading, for example, that it can undermine their interest in reading. You go from liking reading, and then if you reward it, eventually they expect the reward and they don't like to read as much. Incentives can be tricky. And as well as with punishment, I've seen a lot lately in this area suggesting that punishment is not very effective. I'm not sure of your thoughts on that, but what are some do's and don'ts when it comes to using consequences and incentives to modify behavior?
I would say first and foremost that parents should be, I think, immediately skeptical of anybody that's drawing a line in the sand about something being not effective at all or hyper effective always, would be my biggest thing. And that also, I think, without knowing exactly what it is that you're talking about, I think a lot of the times the devil is in the details with things like somebody is saying punishment doesn't work. Well, are they saying that punishment sort of on a theoretical level doesn't work, or are they saying that in practice most people are unable to implement punishment procedures consistently and effectively? One of those I have more inclination to have an easier time agreeing with. The second one, and the first one I would vehemently disagree with. So I think getting it straight, but understanding that there is a gray area for all of this, and that it is possible to use punishment procedures. It's possible to use them ethically and effectively. It's difficult. It's possible to use incentives, and fade them effectively, and not have them cause the problem, the undermining problem that you were talking about. It's tricky to do that. In some cases, experts can't do it effectively. So it's more a word of caution to parents about exercising judgment, and I think being conservative when it comes to introducing those things. As incentives go, or punishments go, I guess, going back to one of the things we touched on earlier, I would be more apt to perhaps consider an incentive for that kind of closed-ended task, the math facts thing. Use an incentive to teach a kid to add numbers 1 through 10 together, because once they master that skill, it is very unlikely that it's going to go away, and I can ditch the reinforcement and be okay. But if I need to incentivize something that's ongoing, like gym attendance, I want to be a lot more careful about introducing some over-the-top incentive to maintain that behavior, because then there's I think a good chance that you're going to have to maintain the incentive as well over the long haul. So thinking about that, and Dad, do you have anything else off the top of your head?
Yeah, and I may have a little bit different take on this, and our take in the new edition of the book was different, at least around this. We pretty much shied away from a lot of discussion about incentives and consequences, and certainly punishment, um, for a couple reasons. Um, Number one, the issues that Colin brings up, they're very difficult to implement. They're very difficult even for people who are, Colin and I are both trained as behavior analysts. Um, and so,
Right. So you know the right. So you're saying that there's an element of if you know the research on these tasks, they theoretically can be applied in a parenting setting, but the average person doesn't know, the reinforcement schedule and how that could make things complex. So, do you reward every time? Do you reward some of the time? That's what I'm getting is that there is a scenario, there is a path with these types of strategies, but as you mentioned, Colin, just proceed with caution.
Yeah,
I,
in theory you can do it. In practice, you can end up behind the wheel of a car with a really powerful engine and really bad brakes, and not and kind of dig yourself a deep hole without realizing that you're doing it.
I think that one of the things we've tried to concentrate on is first of all, and I've certainly seen this in educational situations, that again, kids value mastery. The sense of accomplishment that comes from mastery is it's hard to estimate how powerful that is for kids. And self-monitoring, um, you know, in in um, in behavior analysis, precision teaching has become not become, it's been around for a long time. But the notion of precision teaching is gradual acquisition of a skill and you tracking your own acquisition of that skill over time. And that's turned out to be really important. If you start with small enough steps and you're patient enough about how to go about doing that, then mastery and self-monitoring become very powerful incentives in themselves because that's really what kids, I mean, I look at that as a kind of, if you want, a natural drive that kids have, to master their environment, to solve problems effectively. And so a lot of that can take place in the absence of I think, necessarily needing incentives if you're patient about how, you go about doing it. But I guess the other thing I'd say about consequences is we focused more on natural and logical consequences. And, you know, those go back a long way. But the notion about natural consequences, when Colin was young, we gave up early on deciding that he shouldn't wear shorts in the wintertime to go to school. It was a battle that we just didn't feel like it was worth it to undertake.
Hmm.
And so we left it what it was, and there were days when it worked for him, and I suspect that there were days when it didn't. But it was the kind of natural consequence that you could live with, over a period of time. My wife was a teacher for 47 years. You know, if kids wanted to go out without a coat on, then they would let them go out. They certainly wouldn't let them get frostbitten or anything like that. But just to experience what this is all about, rather than giving them the lecture beforehand about all the ill consequences that might come as a result of that. And then the natural consequences. I think that the incentive that we relied on most consistently is the first then incentive. If you do this, then you're able to do that. It's the old Premack principle of, preferred activity. When a preferred activity follows a less preferred activity, it increases the likelihood that the less preferred activity will get accomplished in order for the kid to get access to the preferred activity. So again, it's the old, if you eat your vegetables, then you get dessert. Or if you try this food out, then you can have a treat after dinner. Those kinds of things. I think that those are really valuable. You asked about do's and don'ts. One of the don'ts is we always want to start off with if this, then this, rather than if you don't do this, then this is what's going to happen. Because immediately number one, you're not labeling what behavior that you want. So the parent doesn't tell the child what they want, they tell them what they don't want. And secondly, there's nothing for the child to look forward to. So we try to frame as much as possible any kind of incentive, first in our good example, in a positive kind of way all of the time, so the kid has something to look forward to and understands the expected behavior.
The last thing I would say is when you're a parent, whatever the incentive is, or if it's a natural consequence or whatever you've chosen, you've also got to take a deep breath and ride with it. I tell my 3 or 4-year-old daughter, I tell my 3.5-year-old daughter, you get a treat if you eat this broccoli. And she doesn't eat the broccoli. 5 minutes goes by, she hasn't touched the broccoli. As a parent, I really want to say, hey, remember, hey, I told you, hey, why don't we go look at the treats? Why not? The broccoli's really good. It tastes great. I find myself trying to convince her of why my contingency, my first then, is not only just in place, but it's a really good idea. And I find that parents, again, they dig themselves into a hole because it's like, I don't want to rely on the actual consequence. I want to put it into place because that's what I think I should do. And then I don't ever want to get there because I don't want to face what happens when my daughter doesn't eat that broccoli and doesn't get that treat. And so I would say, set expectations that are also within your ability and confidence to implement and follow through on. Okay. And don't worry about if it's, if you decide to let it go one night, then let the whole thing go. Don't make a half measure and then cave, and just don't even, some nights I'm just like, you know what? I'm not even going to say anything, and she'll just get the treat after dinner because I'm too tired to have this fight. And other nights I say, okay, I'm going to do this and I've got the time and energy and we're going to ride this out, So I would just encourage parents to operate within your comfort zone and try to be consistent with how you implement the consequences or incentives.
Well, I feel like we've only begun to scratch the surface of fostering executive skills in kids, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for being on today, Richard and Colin Guare.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. It was a pleasure.
On Richard and Colin, visit smartbutscatteredkids.com or pick up a copy of the second edition of Smart But Scattered, the revolutionary executive skills approach to helping kids reach their potential wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowedo-that-podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?